Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. Back with some more vibes for you. Yes, I am Mr. Giant. And we're continuing with the history of England. And this episode is called Ashes, Extra History. And it's the number 4 episode and Ting. Now, it's been fun watching this year. I'm excited to see what's going to go on here. Had a little brain freeze there for a minute to take, but we're running, you know what I mean? And extra history, man, as usual. And sometimes I don't say it in every video. Check out the video in the description. The link is in the description. Go to Extra History, check it out, see the vibe they're coming with, because they have a lot of good vibes there to check out, a lot of things to learn in that place and thing there, you know what I mean? So check them out. They're kind of cool thing, you know what I mean? Okay, what am I doing here? I'm playing with my chair. I'm going down a little bit. But let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer here, see what I go on.
David, you are doing a great job on this series. Just like your podcast, the History of England podcast, I am learning a ton.
Thanks, Matthew. Tell me, have you ever been to England?
I have, but Zoe has been wanting to go. Any suggestions what we should do when we get there?
Well, you might want to carry out an experiment when you get round to it. Wander into a pub, get yourself a pint of the finest ale, and look around for anyone wearing open-toed sandals and a pair of socks. Introduce yourself to them, express your love of English history, and ask them if they've heard of the Black Prince. You have a very fair chance of getting a 5-hour poem with added slideshow and dance routine. Try the same thing with a military hero called Bertrand du Guesclin, and all you'll get is blank stares. Bertrand du Guesclin was a French hero. He realized that the English were formidable on the set-piece field of battle, but that the French had far greater resources, that if fought in the right way, the English could not win in the long term. So Guesclin and his new king, Charles V, listened to the words of the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus. If you can win a battle
Quintus
without
Fabius
having to fight
Maximus.
in anger, then you are the true victor. Guesclin avoided battle. He fortified French towns to choke the English free companies. He took the war to the lands held in France by the English. The English were forced onto the defensive. Now it was the new subjects of the English crown suffering from fire and sword. He won over French barons in English-held lands to come back to France. He fought only when the odds were overwhelming in his favour and when he could choose the battleground. Edward fought back. He appealed to English patriotism by using the English language. At the start of the war, he'd warned that the French were trying to eradicate English, to destroy all memory of the English people. In 1362, for the very first time, Parliament was opened in English and it now became the language of the law courts. Previously, all of this had been done in French. In the 1370s, royal proclamations once more sounded the alarm of the threat to the English language. But nothing seemed to work. Even English victories turned to failure. In 1367, the Black Prince won a battle.
You know, that sounds kind of familiar to these times, but only it's just ordinary people. Like, you come here, and even I, who speak perfectly good English, because I'm from a British colony and English is the main language, people still tell me to speak English. They do, man. I'd say something and they'd go, speak English, man. I can't understand you. And, people get really upset because they say they can't understand my English. So it's like, it's just the ordinary people that's pushing to, oh no, they're gonna wipe out the English language. We're gonna be speaking African. We're gonna be speaking Spanish. We're gonna be speaking this, that. So everybody should learn to speak English. Which all over the world, English is actually taught. Because if it's not taught, how are you gonna do business unless no businessman is gonna learn a bunch of different languages. They could have interpreters, but in these times, who trusts who? You know what I mean? So it's a really strange world we live in. You know what I mean? But pretty much everywhere in the world that's got a decent educational system, you learn to speak English. It's one of the languages you learn. Now, it also depends on where you live, because, where I live, since we live close to South America, and I know they still teach Spanish in schools here, but they emphasize it there because we live so close to South America. But I just find it funny that that's the rallying call there. You know what I mean? Nobody's going to speak English anymore. The French shall take over. It's relatively the same thing. Only is but then some politicians say the same thing here too. So I guess in a way, it mirrors.
English victories turned to failure. In 1367, the Black Prince won a battle against Gesla in Spain as extraordinary as any. But the English fought on behalf of a villainous man, Pedro the Cruel, whose greedy schemes were doomed to fail.
Pedro the Cruel.
And in this fight on behalf of an evil man, we get to one of the great tragedies of the 100 Years' War. For here, the Black Prince contracted an illness that would stay with him until his death, and which robbed him of his powers and humanity. In fact, death stalked the English camp. The great Earl of Lancaster had died in 1361, other captains fell thick and fast. Warwick in 1369, John Chandos in 1369, Walter Manny in 1372, and in 1369, Edward's queen and soulmate Philippa joined them too. Edward's court, the bright and glorious assembly of all the talents, unstoppable, for whom all turned to gold, was falling to pieces. And in France, English campaigns seemed now to do nothing but wander aimlessly in the countryside, while the conquered French nobles conspired with Guesclin to open their gates to any passing French troop. As the glory turned to ashes, the strain showed. The Black Prince, supposed model of chivalry, butchered the people of Limoges with a brutality that shocked even the English. The story of Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, is in many ways a story of tragedy, of two men whose talents and achievements made them shining heroes of their time, exemplars of chivalry, worshipped by their contemporaries, but who saw their triumphs turn to disaster and their lives turn to personal tragedy and loss. Death in 1360 would have been such a better career move. Edward's mind had become weak and enfeebled. In the vast royal palaces, lost without his queen, Edward had taken a mistress, Alice Perrers. Alice created a clique around him through which Edward's nobles and even his sons couldn't penetrate. Alice persuaded Edward to appoint incompetents to military command on the basis that their support for her was more important than their military capability. Alice became daily richer and more powerful. In France, England's cause became more hopeless by the day. In 1373, all of what had been gained had been lost. And
wow.
The great captain of the glory days, the Captal de Bouche, was locked in a French jail where he'd spent the rest of his days too dangerous to release. Only by the skin of their teeth did the English hang on to Gascony and Calais. Edward's personal humiliation was maybe worse. In 1375, now 63 years old, he arranged a glorious tournament and gave pride of place to his Alice. Onlookers were shocked at the sight of a mistress, treated like the queen they'd all loved. The tournament was a mockery, a parody of the great celebrations of chivalry of his glory.
He's falling fast. Edward is falling.
Alice secretly married someone else. Behind his back, Alice engaged in extortion and bribery, selling access to the king to the highest bidder. In fact, it was the Commons of Parliament that acted to remove Alice. The Parliament of 1376 was exceptional in refusing to dance to the tune of the great men. Edward's second son, John of Gaunt, was furious as ordinary merchants and gentry, mere commoners, set up a council, presented 141 petitions, and refused to grant any taxation until the king had agreed to them. This parliament became known as the Good Parliament and is one of the very few examples of the medieval parliament asserting its power. But the end of the story had finally arrived. In May 1376, the aged and infirm Edward sat and watched his eldest son, the Black Prince, slowly die. The next year, Edward himself went into terminal decline. Around him, his household deserted him as his powers faded. When he died, the deceived and dying hero of Cressy was alone with his venal and corrupt mistress until Alice stripped the rings from his fingers and fled.
Wow!
His reign was
Alice in
centuries as a golden age.
action.
His was the face of medieval chivalry, brave, magnificent, a warrior to his fingertips, who built a glittering court around him as close to the legendary Arthur as we'll ever get. Edward's successor was the Black Prince's son, Richard II. He was 11 in 1377. Expectations were high. His nobles expected a return to the good old days. Richard would surely be a chip off the old Black Prince's block. Sadly, no one ended up being quite sure what kind of block Richard's chip actually came from. The Black Prince, he was not. In 1381, a rebellion by impoverished peasants tore through London. Peasants destroyed the royal uncle John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace, ransacked London, and beheaded the Archbishop of Canterbury. Not a stellar recommendation for the quality of his reign. Richard was a strange personality, artistic, intelligent, pretty, affectionate to his friends, but a poor governor of people, tyrannical, volatile. To be a successful medieval monarch, you needed a combination of utter ruthlessness and the ability to manage a bunch of very powerful magnates. Richard vacillated where he should have acted, and he acted where he should have let matters alone. Richard was a great believer in the absolute God-given primacy of the king. Yes, the will of the king was paramount. Yes, he had been anointed by God, but for all this, the king was primus inter pares, first amongst equals. He must govern with the consent of his great men and his people. Richard had another failing. He hated war. Nowadays, we might think that's pretty sensible. Back then, it made him as mad as a box of cheese. War was the very job of nobility. What would happen to society without a warlike nobility to protect church and people? At a dramatic tournament in 1396,
But that's kind of the same thing now, though.
Had agreed to trial by battle to prove who was guilty and who was innocent. One of them was Henry Bolingbroke, a grandson of Edward III. As they levelled their lances and spurred their war horses forward, suddenly the king raised his wand and ordered them to stop, and he banished both of them. Within 2 years, Bolingbroke was back with an army, Richard was murdered alone in a cold dungeon, and Bolingbroke had become the troubled usurper, King Henry IV. Fortunately for the English, the French could take no advantage. The new French king, Charles VI, was a minor in 1380, and the French never dealt well with minorities. Their dukes, the brothers of the old king, squabbled and pinched each other. Just when Charles VI assumed power and restored balance, he began to suffer from a mental illness that would afflict him for the rest of his life. At one point, he was convinced he was made of glass and terrified he'd be shattered. It was a disaster for France.
Wow.
Meanwhile, the young man who'd fought with his father, King John at Poitiers, was now a grown man, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Duke Philip had become so fabulously wealthy and so powerful that for much of the 15th century...
How do they give them their names? I'm gonna have to find, a list of names. Philip the Bold. How did he boldly take power or something? Or was he bold to go to war at the drop of a hat?
His dynasty was practically independent from control by the French Valois kings, and the struggle between the French crown and Burgundy would allow France once more to be ravaged by their ancient enemy. Back in England, Henry IV spent all his reign just holding on to power, desperately trying to keep his dynasty, the House of Lancaster, on the throne. He achieved little else except to raise one of England's most exceptional kings, Henry V. And it was Henry V that would make the French pay for their divisions.
Alright, we're going into Henry V now, so that's coming up on the 5th episode of this. I'm looking forward to that. Yes, I. Anyway, man, I hope you guys enjoy watching this with me. Enjoy learning a thing or two. Hit me up in the comment section. Tell me if you see any fallacies in the history there, any missteps and thing. Let a brother know. Link in the description so you could go check it out yourself and all of that. In the meantime, y'all take care of each other, alright? Cool runnings.